With nowhere to go, an elderly couple receives an abandoned mansion, and the hidden safe changes everything. Martha never expected life to turn upside down in such a short time. She thought the worst surprises were behind her, that at that stage of life she had already seen enough not to be frightened by anything else. She was wrong. It was a piece of paper that started everything. A piece of paper her son placed in front of her on a Wednesday afternoon, with a pen already uncapped in his hand and a smile she recognized many months later as the smile of someone who already knows what's about to happen. Nathan was their only son. He was 42, had a business that never worked out, and an impressive ability to seem sincere when he was lying. "It's a guarantee, Mom. It's just so I can get the loan. You won't even feel it." Arthur was in the kitchen at that moment. Martha didn't call him. She looked at that paper, at the tiny print she could barely see without her glasses, and signed. She signed because he was her son. She signed because a lifetime of marriage had accustomed her to trusting the people she loved. It was a habit that had never needed to be questioned until then. It took her 6 months to understand what she had done. When the bank sent the first notice, Nathan had his phone on silent. When the second one was sent, he had already changed his address. On the third, a lawyer showed up at the door with a folder under his arm and a look of someone who doesn't like his own job. The house where she had painted the kitchen wall yellow, where Arthur had fixed the window grill 3 times, where they had cried through their worst pains and celebrated their smallest joys for 30 years. That house was taken on a winter afternoon with them still inside. Martha packed the clothes into the blue suitcase with wheels. Arthur put on the orange jacket he had bought at a street fair, pulled on the grey wool cap she had knitted for him years ago, and stood in the empty living room for a time she couldn't measure. She went to him, took his hand, and they left together. Neither of them looked back. Look, when I first read this part, I had to stop for a second. Because there's a very specific pain in it, the pain of being older and having no ground beneath your feet, of having built your whole life and suddenly being there with suitcase in hand. There are things you read and feel like you know that pain from somewhere. They spent 3 weeks at Mrs. Mildred's house, a longtime friend who lived in a working-class neighborhood of a rural small town. Mildred had good intentions, but the house was small, her husband wasn't enthusiastic about the situation, and an awkwardness hung over everything. At lunchtime, at bedtime, when sitting in the living room and not knowing what to do with your hands. Arthur didn't complain. That was always his way, holding everything inside and letting it show only in his posture, in his slightly hunched shoulders, in his gaze that stayed fixed in one direction without seeing anything. Martha knew that look. She knew the size of what he was hiding. It was in the 4th week, on a Monday morning, that the letter arrived. Martha was at Mildred's kitchen table when she saw the envelope among the other papers. Her name was written on it by hand, in a firm old-fashioned script she didn't recognize at once. The return address was a county registrar's office in Gatlinburg, a place she barely knew existed. She opened it slowly, like someone afraid of what might be inside. It was an inheritance notice. Her great-aunt Gertrude, a woman Martha had seen at most 4 or 5 times in her life, at family gatherings when she was still young, a serious lady not given to affection, had passed away a few weeks earlier, at over 90 years old, without leaving children, and in the will drawn up at the county registrar's office with all the formalities, the only name was Martha's. The property, an old 3-story mansion in Gatlinburg with a large piece of land. Abandoned for many years after the departure of Gertrude's husband, market value undetermined given its state of disrepair. Martha read it 3 times, then she called Arthur. He also read it 3 times. Then the 2 of them stayed silent for a while, looking at each other with that unspoken understanding that only exists after decades together. "Is it ours?" Arthur asked at last. "It's mine," she corrected slowly. "But it's ours." Mildred was the most excited of the 3. "Go see it right away. It could be a blessing." Martha wasn't so sure. An abandoned mansion in a small mountain town sounded more like a problem than a solution, but they didn't have much of a choice. With the little money they still had saved, they bought bus tickets. The trip lasted nearly 8 hours. When the bus stopped at the bus depot of the small mountain town, it was cold, a cold unlike anything Martha had ever known, dry biting, white. Snow was piled up on the sidewalks, on the rooftops, on the leafless trees. In any other circumstance she would have found it beautiful, but with the heavy suitcase in her hand and uncertainty in her chest, the snow just seemed like one more hardship they'd have to deal with. A cab took them to the address listed in the county registrar's office documents. The driver said nothing during the ride. He stopped in front of a rusty gate, took the payment, and drove off without even looking back. Martha and Arthur stood at the gate, each holding their suitcase, staring at what lay ahead. It was enormous. 3 stories, arched windows, columns on the facade that must have once been imposing. But it was covered in ice in a way that seemed impossible. Not a passing frost, but layer upon layer accumulated over years of abandonment. Icicles hung from the eaves like enormous teeth. The front steps were buried under packed snow. The trees around it were white, leafless branches, twisted by the cold, as if all the time in that place had stopped all at once. Arthur put his arm around Martha's shoulders without saying anything. She took a deep breath of the frigid air. She felt the cold enter and settle in her chest. "At least it's ours," she said at last. It took them nearly an hour to get the rusty gate open and reach the front door. The key the county clerk had sent along with the documents was large, heavy, its metal darkened by time. It went into the lock with a harsh grating sound, resisted for a second, and the door gave way with a creak that echoed through whatever lay inside. The smell that came out was of time standing still, of old wood and dampness and years of silence. Martha stepped inside. The entrance hall was twice the height of the largest room she had ever seen. A dark wooden staircase curved up to the second floor, solid despite the neglect. There was furniture draped in yellowed white sheets, like figures standing in a row in the dimness. Dust everywhere. A window with a cracked pane let in a strip of cold light that illuminated the worn wooden floor. "Where do we sleep tonight?" Arthur asked with that dry humor that only surfaced when he was trying not to show how big the problem really was. "Let's find a room that isn't falling apart," Martha replied in the same tone. They spent the first hours exploring room by room. The second floor had less damage than the first. They found a bedroom with an old but intact bed, a thick blanket folded in the chest at its foot, and a window that closed without letting in any wind. It wasn't much. It was enough for that night. Martha heated water on a portable stove they had brought in their suitcase. They ate sitting on the edge of the bed in silence, listening to the wind beating against the glass and the ice crackling on the eaves outside. "Do you regret it?" Arthur asked. She thought before answering honestly. "No. But I still don't know what we're going to do with all of this." He didn't answer, but his hand found hers on the old mattress and stayed there. In the days that followed, they gradually discovered the house. There were rooms that could barely be opened, full of stacked furniture and old boxes with objects from another era. There was a large kitchen with a cast-iron stove and a pantry that still smelled of dried herbs from some last time someone had been through there. There was a dining room with a long table and carved wooden chairs, everything covered in dust so thick it seemed part of the decor, and there were paintings on the walls, landscapes and portraits of people Martha didn't recognize, with serious expressions and clothes from decades past. She walked through those hallways sometimes just looking at those faces, trying to understand what life had happened within those walls. In one of the second-floor hallways, there was a painting different from the others. Bigger, heavier frame with elaborate carvings, a winter landscape with a house in the background that had something familiar in the composition, though she couldn't explain what. Martha stopped in front of it several times in those first days, unable to say why that particular painting made her stand still. It was on the 5th morning that she noticed the painting was slightly tilted to one side. She reached out to straighten it, and felt it was held by something more than the nail. It resisted in a different way. She called Arthur. He carefully examined the edges of the frame, running his fingers over the carvings. "There's something behind it." It took nearly half an hour of careful work for them to move the painting without damaging anything. When it came off the wall, it revealed a precise cutout in the wood panel, a small rectangular door carefully embedded, almost invisible if you didn't know it was there, and in the center of that door, a steel wheel with number markings around it. A safe. Martha stared at it for a long time without speaking. Arthur stood beside her. They both understood, without needing to say it, that this wasn't a coincidence. Gertrude had hidden something there on purpose, carefully, during a time they couldn't calculate. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The safe had a numeric combination, 5 digits turned by the steel dial. They tried everything they could imagine. Their great-aunt's birthdays found in documents scattered around the house, the year of Gertrude's marriage to Amos, recorded in an old Bible, simple sequences. The dial wouldn't budge. "We need someone who understands this," Arthur said finally, with the patience of someone who recognizes his own limits. They decided to leave it for later. There were more urgent things that week. Enough firewood to heat at least 2 rooms, checking the roof structure over the bedroom where they slept, and finding out if there was anyone in the small town willing to help with basic repairs without charging an impossible price. It was at the town general store downtown that Martha found Mr. Silas, a man of about 75, with a thick white mustache and hands covered in calluses from decades of work. He was the only locksmith and tinsmith still active in town, one of those people the entire community knows exists and seeks out when needed. When Martha described what they had found, he didn't seem surprised. "Mrs. Gertrude's house," he said, as if it were the most natural subject in the world. "I knew someone would show up there one day." "Did you know her?" "I knew her husband, Amos, when I was much younger." He paused, looking at a point beyond Martha. "She stayed alone in there for many years after he was gone. She refused help from anyone. Every now and then we'd see the light on at night and think everything was fine." Martha felt a knot in her chest at that. An old woman alone in that enormous mansion in the cold, shutting out the world. She tried not to think about it too much, but the image stayed with her. Silas went to see the safe the next day. He examined the handle, the edges, the mechanism with the same professional silence of a man who'd seen a lot in his 70-some years. He stayed there almost half an hour, without saying a word. Then he got up with an effort and said he could try to open it, but it would take a few days. It was exactly that week that Gregory showed up. Martha didn't know who he was when he knocked on the gate on a cloudy afternoon. A man in his 50s, too well dressed for that small Gatlinburg town, with a leather suitcase in his hand, and a smile that was wide but didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Mrs. Gertrude's second cousin," he explained, sitting in the dusty living room where she received him cautiously. "Gregory Miller. I looked after her health these past few years as a good relative should." Martha said nothing. She waited for him to get to the point. He opened the suitcase with a calculated gesture, carefully took out a piece of paper. "Mrs. Gertrude promised me this house. I have here a letter, written in her own hand, leaving me the property as a token of gratitude for everything I did for her." The letter was handwritten on a sheet of cream paper, with a signature at the bottom. Martha took the paper. Read it slowly, word by word. Then she looked at Gregory with a calm he clearly hadn't expected. "I'll need to consult the county clerk before we have any conversation," she said. Of course. Of course." He closed the suitcase with the same gesture. "But I need you to understand that I came from far away, that I have rights here, and that I have no intention of causing trouble. I just want what's rightfully mine." After he left, Martha sat in the chair for far too long. Arthur was the one at her side. "Do you believe him?" he asked. "No." The answer came before she'd even thought about it. It was a certainty she couldn't yet explain in words, but that had settled in her chest like something familiar. She called the county clerk the next day. The man confirmed. The will was legal, registered with all formalities, and there was no other document contesting it. A personal letter, even if authentic, had no legal standing to contest a formal will, but he advised Martha seriously that she be careful, that this kind of situation could get complicated when value was involved. Value. Martha still didn't know for sure how much the property was worth, and Gregory, by the way he behaved, seemed to know something she didn't, which was a problem. Silas came back on Thursday with his tools. He spent the whole morning working on the safe, in total silence, while Martha and Arthur waited in the hallway, unable to keep still. When the safe door finally gave way with a dry metallic click, Silas slowly stood up and took a step back. "It's open," he said simply. Martha knelt in front of the safe. Inside there was a thick envelope, yellowed with time, a cloth bundle folded with care, and underneath it all a small metal box with a simple latch. She took out the envelope first. Inside were letters, several of them carefully folded in date order, and along with them a more recent document, folded in half, on paper different from the others. She unfolded the document first. It was a land appraisal report, issued by a company 3 years ago. The estimated value of the property was far greater than anything Martha had imagined possible. The land beyond the mansion included a large area of preserved forest that had caught the interest of Alpine Peaks Hospitality Group to build a mountain lodge complex. That company had made a formal purchase proposal to Gertrude. Gertrude had refused. The proposal, with the amount they had offered, was there folded together with the appraisal report. Martha held the paper in her hand for a time she couldn't measure. She looked at the number more than once, because it didn't seem real at first. "I had to stop here, because when life turns in a way you didn't expect, at a moment when you no longer had any expectation at all, it gives you a different kind of chill in your stomach. A good chill, mixed with disbelief. They had left their home with nowhere to go, and they had come to this. Life has these things you can't even imagine while you're inside the problem." Arthur had knelt down beside her. He saw the number. He stayed silent. He put his hand on her shoulder with the same gesture as always, which said more than any words could. Martha picked up the letters. They were Gertrude's letters, some addressed to her husband Amos, written after he had left, never sent anywhere. She only wrote because she needed to, because sometimes writing is the only way to keep talking to someone who is no longer here. Others to someone Martha didn't know by name, and the last one, the most recent by the dates, had a recipient that made her breath catch. It was addressed to her, to Martha, with her full name. She opened it with hands that trembled slightly, more than she would have admitted. "Martha, my sister's daughter, you didn't get to know me as you should have. I know that. It was my fault, because I was always a woman of few affections and fewer words, but I watched you from afar over the years, through the stories that reached me through people I trusted. I know you were good. Truly good. Not just in appearance. I also know what your son did. It reached me through someone I trusted. I was angry for a while, then sad. Then I understood that you did what a mother does. You believed. And believing isn't weakness, even when it hurts like weakness. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life depending on someone who doesn't deserve your dependence. That's why you're the one who gets the house. It's not an inheritance of value, it's an inheritance of intention. A man will show up from Amos's side of the family who will say that I promised the house to him. I didn't promise anything to that man. The letter he has was written by him, not by me. My handwriting has a detail that I never changed in 70 years, the capital letter A. You'll see the difference if you compare it with the letters that are inside here. Take care of the house. It has more history than it seems. With affection, Gertrude. Martha had to sit on the floor. It wasn't a decision. It was her legs that decided. Arthur read the letter over her shoulder. Then he went to the hallway window and stood looking outside for a while without saying anything. She knew him well enough to know what he was doing, reorganizing everything, putting each thing in a place he could understand. The cloth bundle contained old jewelry, earrings, necklaces, a brooch with stones, and some old folded bills. They weren't a fortune. They wouldn't change their lives on their own. But they were enough to breathe, to start. The little metal box held old photographs in black and white, with scalloped edges. Amos and Gertrude in moments that someone had thought important to record. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in thin paper, 2 wedding rings. Martha looked at those rings for a long time. She understood there what the house had been to Gertrude. Not an asset, not property. It was a memory she couldn't let go of. and by leaving it to Martha, she was leaving it to someone who would understand that, who would know what it is to love a place not for what it's worth, but for what it holds. The next day, Martha took the letters and went to Gregory at the local inn where he was staying. He opened the door with the same calculated smile. She walked in, placed the 2 letters side by side on the small table in the bedroom, the one he had brought and one of Gertrude's letters, and pointed to the capital letter A in each of them. The difference was clear to anyone who looked closely. The A in his letter had a shape that never appeared in hers. It was a small detail, but it was consistent on every page, in every line, across decades of writing. Gregory fell silent. The smile vanished for the first time. "Mrs. Gertrude was very specific about you," Martha said with a calm she didn't know she had in her. "I'm taking this to the county clerk along with copies of everything that was in the safe. If you want to contest it, that's the legal route." He tried to speak. She didn't let him. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Gregory left the rural small town the next morning. Martha only found out because Silas told her at the town general store with barely concealed satisfaction. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The weeks that followed were hard in a different way, the good kind of hard, the kind that wears you out but doesn't eat away at you. Martha and Arthur began cleaning the mansion room by room, at a pace that matched what the 2 of them could handle. Mr. Silas brought 2 nephews who were bricklayers, and with the money from the jewelry sold to a goldsmith in the nearest town, they started fixing the most urgent parts. The roof, the windows, the heating that had stopped working so many years ago that no one remembered when it had last functioned. The small town reacted with the slow curiosity of people who aren't in a hurry to get close, but also can't stay away. At first, it was glances at the town general store, then quiet questions. Then neighbors showed up with food, with a borrowed tool, with stories about the house that they hadn't asked for but needed to hear. A woman named Enid, 81 years old with a memory that apologized for nothing, showed up one afternoon with a bowl of soup and sat on the front steps with Martha for 2 hours, telling stories from when the mansion was still lived in. About the parties Amos and Gertrude used to throw in the summer when they were young, about the music you could hear from outside, about how the house had once been the heart of the entire neighborhood. Martha listened to all of it with an attention Enid clearly appreciated, and she began to understand that the house wasn't just hers, it was a piece of the memory of an entire community that had been without it for a long time. The process of negotiating with the company that wanted the land was long and careful. Martha hired a lawyer from the town itself, a young man named Ryan, who knew the local laws and took every step seriously as if it were his own case. They didn't sell the entire property. They sold only a portion of the woodland, in an agreement that preserved the mansion, the garden, and a significant strip of land around it, with clauses requiring the company to respect the environment and the local community. The amount they received was more than enough to truly renovate the mansion. Not all at once, piece by piece, with care, with respect for what those walls had been. When the facade was restored months later, the stone clean, the columns free of ice, the windows with new glass shining in the weak morning sun, Enid came to look from the outside and stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Then she said, in the thin voice of someone holding back something big, "It looks like her again." Martha carried that phrase in her chest for days. As for Nathan, he called on a Sunday night when they'd already been in the mansion for a month. Martha's phone rang with a number she recognized, even without it being saved. She stared at the screen for a while, and Arthur respected the silence without asking. She answered. "Mom." Her son's voice was lower than usual, without the rehearsed tone she had learned to recognize. "I heard you 2 are doing well." "We are," she said. Silence for a few seconds. "I wanted to—" "Nathan." She stopped him firmly. "I know what you're trying to say, and I know that one day we'll have that conversation properly, but not today." She hung up. Arthur was by her side. He didn't ask what had been said. He knew her face well enough. Sometimes you need time before you can hear an apology, because hearing it too soon can make the pain seem smaller than it really was. and their pain had been great. Nathan came back 3 months later. He didn't call ahead. He showed up at the gate with an expression Martha had never seen on her son's face. No rehearsed smile, no prepared story. Just a 42-year-old man carrying the weight of what he'd done in every detail of his posture. Martha opened the gate. She didn't hug him. It wasn't time for that yet. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." They sat in the big kitchen that smelled of good wood and the bread Arthur had baked that morning. Arthur stayed in the living room by his own choice. That conversation was between mother and son, and he knew it. Nathan put his hands on the table and began to talk. It wasn't a neat explanation. It was stumbling, with pauses in the wrong places, with moments where he started a sentence and didn't know how to finish it. It was everything words become when they're real. He talked about the business that wasn't working out, the desperation that had grown without him noticing, the decision he made without thinking about what he was doing to the people who loved him most. He said he had no excuse. He said he knew he didn't. Martha listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, silence lingered in the kitchen for a moment. "You won't be able to go back to what you were before," she said at last. "I need you to truly understand that." "I know. But you can become something else. Something different." It wasn't a full forgiveness that day. It was a door opened just a crack, small but real. And sometimes that's exactly what life needs to be able to move forward. In the spring, when the ice was gone and the trees in the yard had grown their leaves again, still shyly green, like someone not sure they can trust the temperature, Martha and Arthur placed 2 chairs on the front porch. They weren't fancy chairs. They were the wooden ones they'd found on the 2nd floor, sanded and painted by themselves on a Saturday afternoon with paint Silas had given them. But they were theirs, in that house that was theirs. On an afternoon when the sun was still weak but present, Arthur asked, looking out at the garden Martha was slowly learning to care for, "Do you think Gertrude knew it would end up like this?" Martha kept looking at the first flowers that had bloomed that week, timid colors among the fresh green. "I think she knew it would end up some way, and she trusted that we'd find the path." A small conversation, the kind that says far more than it seems. Martha was 65 when she arrived in that small town with a suitcase in her hand, not knowing what she'd find, with no expectation other than surviving the next day. She was 66 when she understood that the frozen mansion wasn't the gift Gertrude had given her. The gift was the second chance, and she didn't intend to waste it. End of story. Gertrude never knew what happened after she wrote that letter, but somehow she knew enough to make the right choice at the right moment. That moves me in a way I can't quite explain. The idea that there are people who watch us from afar more carefully than we imagine, who see what we're worth even when we can't see it ourselves. If this story touched you in any way, tell us about it here in the comments. Where you're from, what you felt, whether you would have made peace with Nathan if you were in Martha's place. I read everything. Drop your like, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. There's plenty more great stories waiting for you here.